First of all, I'm very happy that we have a women's panel, which is very nice for a change. Thank you also very much for the invitation and the great organization to all of you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, always. Towards the end of the day, it becomes more and more difficult to say something that hasn't been said yet, but we knew that when we started this day. So when I was preparing yesterday evening, I thought, well, let's make some notes, and now I have many more notes, and I have to try to get that within a couple of minutes. Our panel's task was to have an academic examination of the service convention and how it will operate in a world tomorrow, of course, with a view of e-service. We would try to keep our contribution short, so indeed we have some time to discuss with you, the audience, because we believe in co-creation, and for that we, of course, need your help. First of all, I would like to emphasize the great success of the Hague Service Convention. With 75 contracting states, is one of the most important and popular conventions worldwide. And celebrating its 55th anniversary next year, it's also clear that it's standing the test of time. And also that's a great accomplishment. Service is, of course, a key issue, as we all know, in national, but especially in cross-border litigation. And in the EU, and I have been part of a couple of studies in recent years, it is also very clear that it is not only very important, but also one of the most problematic areas. But then again, we don't like to talk about problems today, but about challenges and opportunities. So that's what we will do. And of course, within the EU, we are revising the regulation, and that can also serve as an example for the Hague Service Convention. The problems that are caused and that we found in those EU studies are multiple. It's a plurality of authorities. Of course, we have judicial officers, but in other countries also courts or lawyers that are involved in the process, different work methods and local rules. Delays in processing the paperwork, which is really a problem, just simply authorities not replying. Of course, we have the language and translation issues and the insecurity that the lightest form of service that we have now, the postal service, entails. As often, or quite often, the required receipt of notice is not received. The service rules are a key, of course, to a fair trial and are also very relevant, but Louise will talk about that as well in the context of international jurisdiction and the recognition and enforcement. So it also links with other instruments in this area. So on the one hand, and that has been emphasized many times today, we need speed and efficiency to avoid delays and additional litigation costs, of course. But on the other hand, it is pivotal that it is secured that this document actually reaches the addressee and timely, and also of course in a language that he or she understands, as this is crucial for the right to be heard. We've heard a lot about this today, and I think it was good that it was by Arsena, it was emphasized that it's not only about someone receiving it, because that can also be done electronically, but there is also this human aspect, human face of justice, which is very important, I think. I believe that e-service of documents, as well, is increasingly the norm. We heard in the US it's now about 10% of the cases. I don't know exactly how that is in other countries, it really differs. And that's not only necessary to keep up with the way we communicate, and all of us communicate today, but it's also a great opportunity to avoid the apparent trade-off that we currently have between, on the one hand, efficiency and speed, and on the other hand, security. Of course, if we have a good implementation of e-service with the online platforms, etc., then we can both have the speed and efficiency and the security, and that is what we currently lack. But then we also heard of our speakers, was the first speaker, Ted, said that even to get the acknowledgement of receipt by email can be challenging. So we're not there yet. But then last year I gave a presentation and wrote something on this about the e-evidence. And there my title was Old Problems in a New Guise. And that's actually that we're dealing with. Many of those problems are old problems, but now, well, it has a little bit of a different cover, but that creates, not problems, opportunities, of course. One example from the Netherlands, a very small example, because in the Netherlands actually the digitalization of justice has become a bit of a disaster. We're always ashamed to talk about that, and we would like to avoid the topic, but well, it's what it is. But our e-court, and that is not a governmental court, but that was for a period of time in place in the Netherlands as a private organization, managed to reach out to let's say, uncollected debtors much more often than the court does. And why? Simply because they used WhatsApp to send messages to those people. So their response rate, and thus the uncontested part, was much better secured by this e-court simply by using WhatsApp. Of course, it has also some drawbacks, but it's just a small example. Today we've heard by Marie, representing the European Commission, the challenges that we have in the EU to revise the service regulation. And then, of course, looking at the worldwide context, we may wonder how this should work out, because even in the European Union, the mandatory part is actually still quite limited, and we have a provision in there for funding. So, and indeed, that's also what happens. The European Commission funds local projects on e-justice, and of course, within the worldwide context of the Hague Conference, this is not really an option. Good, then the question, and that is also what you will pick up on more in detail, is whether the Service Convention text needs amendment. And if so, which amendments? We've heard about Article 1.2, this address part. We've heard about Article 10. It came up a couple of times, our beloved article. And some of the other provisions might need reflection to, look at the electronic service of documents. But on the other hand, we also very much know that revising such a convention and with all the diplomacy required would be a very long process and might not be the best way forward. So alternatives, but I'm sure you will pick up on that, would be to use a protocol, practice guidelines, and of course we already have the 2016 Service Handbook and the service practical service section on the website. It is very helpful. I think also this notion of functional equivalence, which is basically a matter of interpretation, it's a new word for interpretation in the online world, is commonplace and will bring us a long way. So we don't really need to replace this very successful convention. One other issue that came up when I was preparing this talk was, and the same issue we had, is the ELI UNIDROIT project on European Rules of Civil Procedure, and we hope to complete, well, we are completing it now, and we hope that UNIDROIT and also ELI will adopt those rules next year. That's kind of a horizontal soft law instrument on civil justice. And there, a couple of years ago, we were warned, well, you have to stand the IT fitness test. And then we're also thinking, well, we can put everywhere, like electronic, can also be electronic or any other means, etc. And we will do it here and there, but also there the idea is now, in order to be a little bit more, to stand the test of time, we should put most of those issues in the comments rather than in the black letter rules, because otherwise you will always be lagging behind when developments continue at the speed they have done so far. The very last point I wanted to address was whether perhaps we need a worldwide or other type of instrument that addresses e-justice more in a more horizontal way, because of course it's not only about e-service, it's also about many other instruments. And then of course the first one that comes up is the evidence convention, and in European context the regulation, but also for other family law instruments, for instance. This is very important, and issues of authenticity, confidentiality, integrity, security, privacy are not only there and relevant for e-service of documents, but also for all the others, and that might might also be something that we might engage in, and perhaps not necessarily a convention. It can also be a set of guidelines, etc., that can tackle those issues. What is very important there, and I had a good experience recently or earlier this year at the European Council, where what is so important here, and what is also one of the big mistakes we made in the Netherlands, is that technicians and lawyers really have to work side by side. Because lawyers don't understand the technical part, and the technical people really don't understand what we need legally. What we did at the e-law committee, then we had 2 separate meetings, the tech people and the law people. In the morning, we had to draw up conclusions, what are our main issues, problems, etc. Then we reconvened during lunch, and then after lunch, we had a joint session, and we were on the stage like this with all the technicians and the legal people. And then we discuss the problems as such. And I think that is really the way we will have to work in order to make something work. And I think such an instrument where those people work together in whatever format it is, would greatly benefit international judicial cooperation and will thus further access to justice, the rule of law, and the rule of law in today's globalized and digitized world.
I think.
Okay. Are you going to?
Okay. Thank you very much, Xandra. I'm going back to the technology. So a few words about technology, and I think that so much has already been said, but I'm just adding a few words about that. So today we heard several talks addressing practical difficulties encountered when using information technology in the operation of the Service Convention. Of course, the main challenge remains to ensure access to justice in the world. We use this word today, but not as much as I thought we would use it. Access to justice is fundamental. And we try to facilitate the conduct of international civil proceedings too. That's the main objective. So it is certainly worth examining how the evolution of computer technology can serve these two fundamental objectives: access to justice and conduct of international civil proceedings. We also heard several very interesting proposals for solutions to improve the functioning of the Service Convention by bringing it to the digital age. Yes, we are already there in the digital age, but personally I think that the use of blockchain technology would be the best solution in the context of the Service Convention. From my point of view, it is a major step in the evolution of information technology that cannot be ignored. The blockchain technology has the advantage of being safe. We already heard that today. Once the information, such as a service of a document, is put onto the blockchain, it is time-stamped, tamper-proof, and thus cannot be corrupted or deleted. Furthermore, the information can be easily accessible to authorities from anywhere in the world. So the use of this technology would probably increase efficiency, speed, and security in the international system of service of documents set up by the Service Convention. As suggested today, we could imagine the implementation of a permissioned blockchain, that is a private blockchain, that would be maintained by the Permanent Bureau, that could be maintained also by a contracting state or a central body to be determined. A private blockchain is the first idea that comes to mind when we think of a blockchain in this context. However, a permissioned blockchain presents security risks, a lot of security risks. This is due in particular to the limited number of nodes involved in the operation validation process. Furthermore, if all nodes are located in the same state, this significantly increases the security risk. I think it would be more interesting to think about a new system allowing the service of documents abroad by a permissionless, that is to say, a public blockchain, and not a private blockchain. So you see, I'm the first one today to speak about public blockchain, but I think it's a good idea. This would allow the full benefits of this new technology to be realized. This system would be fully decentralized, that is to say that data would be recorded in multiple places at the same time, without a central data store and without any master copy. The multiplication of nodes, and that's the point, which could be located anywhere in the world, would provide the necessary degree of security. Furthermore, it would be possible to use existing blockchains such as Ethereum, which would reduce significantly the costs. The use of a public blockchain would have the advantage of not centralizing control of the system in the hands of a state or a limited number of states. I think that this point is essential when it comes to transmitting electronic data in a confidential manner at the global level. It seems to me that the use of a private blockchain would make as much sense as if a state were to create a private network similar to the internet to share information at the international level. Anyway, blockchain technology has all the characteristics necessary to simplify the service of documents abroad and improve the functioning of the Service Convention. But we have to admit that the use of a public blockchain would lead to a paradigm shift. The system used for service of documents would be partially outside the control of the states. States will no longer need to trust other states to establish a channel for communication and certification of information, but would trust blockchain technology to ensure the authenticity of the information issued and received. It would not, however, lead to a revolution in the way states operate. States use the internet every day to transmit confidential information, even if they do not have control over the internet. The service abroad of documents by the blockchain could probably be easily adopted in some states that already have a widespread use of computer technology. But people should also be ready to use this type of technology. It has already been mentioned today that computer technology is not yet part of everyday life, everywhere. For instance, the electronic signature, which is a basic use of IT, is clearly not used by everyone on a regular basis. The use of a new technology requires a change in mentality. The establishment of a global system of service of documents by the blockchain could only work if all states that are parties to the Service Convention agree to join in this new system. One of the main practical difficulties that can be anticipated is that this will probably mean giving up sending paper documents. This step has not yet been achieved in many states. Let's take a look at the situation in Switzerland. If we look at the electronic apostille register, the Swiss authorities do not use it because they do not think they need to use it. In practice, a paper document on which the apostille is placed is indeed still required in most cases. However, Switzerland is not a country that refuses to use the internet to facilitate communication between litigants and the authorities. For example, electronic communication with civil courts has been allowed for many years. But litigants rarely use this possibility and remain attached to paper when it comes to communicating with each other and with the civil courts. These examples show that it is always difficult to change a system that exists and works. The emergence of blockchain technology, which is described as revolutionary, may coincide with a paradigm shift in cross-border litigation and civil procedure. Indeed, blockchain could provide a different view of the service of documents abroad by simplifying it through technology. But this would imply that states and litigants switch to a new way of thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florence.
So let me express my thanks to the organizers for including me. I'm particularly pleased to be here because the convention is almost 55 years old, and I spoke at its 50th birthday when we had a conference in Georgetown. And the Service Convention was not only a major accomplishment and milestone for the Hague Conference, but also for the U.S. in its relationship to the Hague Conference. It was the first convention that the U.S. was active as a member of the Hague Conference, and when it ratified the convention, it was the first multilateral treaty for the U.S. to sign onto with respect to international judicial procedure. And it also was the first convention to have a special commission to focus not on amendments, but on using the existing machinery of the convention more effectively to look at the practices and procedures, which of course has now been picked up by the other conventions. It's hard to come up with new things to say after what we've heard all day. We've heard a lot about new technologies, so I'm going to talk briefly about the convention and the text. How do you retool the convention and dress it up for the new world of e-technology? The convention was drafted in a time when borders mattered, in a world that was based on this respect for territoriality and sovereignty. So how do you take a text from paper in the world now of borderless cyberspace and electronic communications? Well, one way is you use functional equivalence, and you go from mail under Article 10A, as we've heard, to email and beyond. Or you take a bricks and mortars address and place it with the functional equivalent, as Nicholas mentioned, of an email address or a website. I want to spend just a little time talking about the tensions between the past service convention and the future one, sort of a Janus two-direction look. The service convention chapeau speaks of its goals of making sure that the addressee has timely notice, avoiding the old notification opaque, and of also improving mutual judicial assistance by simplifying and expediting procedures. Indeed, in 1965, even the use of the central authority to facilitate diplomatic boundaries was very modern. So the goals for the convention included meaningful notice, simple and fast procedures. But in 1965, the other face, so to speak, was this strong sense of sovereignty and not violating the territory of others. So how do we balance these goals and still maintain the integrity of the convention? That is, the desire for efficient notice and respect yet for territoriality. The former goals of the efficient procedure and notice can perhaps be accommodated by interpretation of the text. But can the latter, that of territoriality, be accommodated, or does it require something more? Hard law, or maybe harder soft law? So as Xandra mentioned, I was going to mention a few, and she mentioned as well, options to sort of deal with this middle-aged text and ways to update it. Well, obviously, we could start with hard law and a protocol, but everybody is always afraid a protocol will open a Pandora's box. On the other hand, it could be a very narrow protocol. We could move to the soft law side, another practical handbook or something more aspirational, such as a guide to good practice with acceptable practices, perhaps produced at a special commission, suggested language for legislation, or a middle ground, a legislative note, harder soft law or soft hard law, whichever you look at it. But this was the approach taken by UNCITRAL when it had to update the New York Convention on Recognition and Enforcement of Foreign Arbitral Awards, which of course dated from 1958, and requires that as part of the form that there be an agreement in writing in Article 2 and also in other parts. And so what UNCITRAL did in 2006 was a legislative note that basically was a way to modernize the text, and it was designed to take this traditional paper convention forward into the new technology of electronic commerce. And it had behind it the strength of being an actual commission hard law instrument, so to speak, or sort of hard. This legislative note type of approach, by the way, isn't totally alien to the Hague Conference. In 1985 or 86, when the Sales Convention was drafted, there was a diplomatic session that declared that at the time of the negotiation of the 1955 Hague Convention, consumer sales were not as such identified and envisaged and recommended, therefore, that contracting states should not apply the convention to consumer sales. And the way this declaration and recommendation was done, it was adopted at a diplomatic session so that it had the weight of all countries and not just experts. So it was a stronger way to not do a protocol, but certainly to make it clear how the text should be interpreted, and on behalf of everyone. The other approach to updating the Service Convention, obviously, is through interpretation to reach the functional equivalence, as we've discussed, and as the Practical Handbook talks about. In a way, I like to think of the interpretation as sort of the evil stepsisters approach in the fairy tale Cinderella, where they try to fit the size 40 foot into the size 35 glass slipper. And you've heard examples of how it can be done and how it's been done in some jurisdictions. And there's a certain irony, by the way, that the convention itself is much more rigid than the internal systems of so many countries which have, in fact, embraced e-technologies. And in the age of electronic commerce, concerns with security, authenticity, all these are obviously more significant, including perhaps the one way to solve it through blockchain. So, is the Service Convention still necessary when bricks and mortars no longer exist, your address is unknown, and there are new technologies to bypass it? And I would say, yes, it's necessary, and one of the easiest examples, which Xandra referred to, is its importance in the increasing need to view it in connection with other conventions. In particular, the Hague Conference Conventions, the Choice of Court Convention, and the New Judgments Convention, because one of the actual defenses that was put in first in the Choice of Court Convention and then added also with the identical words but moved up to a higher place as a basis, a discretionary basis to refuse recognition and enforcement of a judgment, was when a document which instituted the proceedings or an equivalent document, including a statement of the essential elements of the claim, was notified to the defendant in the requested state in a manner that is incompatible with fundamental principles of the requested state concerning service of documents. That is, and at least as indicated by one of the delegations that really wanted this in Choice of Court, service should be made under the Hague Service Convention. Otherwise, it is in fact incompatible with fundamental principles of the requested state. And so the Service Convention serves a very important purpose, I think, in that we can look at it and use it as a measuring stick of the acceptable way to serve that is compatible with fundamental principles in contracting states. I want to just make a few comments about the current status of the convention in one contracting state, although I'll be careful because obviously there are many experts on U.S. Law here, but you've heard about the U.S. approach, and U.S. courts have generally been interpreting, bypassing, or ignoring the convention for many years. And it hasn't always been done due to the lack of new technologies. They've simply, judges and lawyers tend to assume if the form of service is not prohibited, and it isn't often because it's a new technology that didn't exist then, that they can do it. Cases construing and misconstruing our domestic internal procedures under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 4F. Broad reading of address unknown so that you're already outside the convention, such as with Chinese e-commerce sellers in a couple of cases, broad construction of domestic, and in the U.S., talking about individual state law, to define when service is complete, so that you therefore are not transmitting, do not have the occasion to transmit abroad, and therefore the convention isn't triggered. And this has even been used in cases of substituted service, where for due process purposes you really do have to send a copy overseas, but the state, the individual state, such as my state, Rhode Island, in one federal case, says, oh, no, once the Secretary of State of the state has the document, service is complete. So also using broad construction and waiver to suggest that service is not being transmitted abroad, or parties are agreeing that service shall be made at a local address. That's the issue currently before a California appellate court in a case called Rockefeller Technologies. So where does the U.S. stand? Well, Ted and I disagree about this, but I see the possibility of decreased use of the Service Convention in connection with cases in the U.S., at least commercial cases, with narrower adjudicative jurisdictional bases, so that there will be fewer U.S. cases where we need to serve a foreign defendant because we don't have jurisdiction over them. But of course, there will be other cases coming in. And perhaps the Service Convention will have increased importance when, and I say when, not if, choice of court is ratified. The Service Convention was made for a world of paper and borders, and if sovereignty is an important underlying value of the Service Convention, new interpretations may not be strong enough to meet that need, and functional equivalence may not be enough, but we need to wait and see how things develop.
Well, we are behind schedule, but I still would like to add, so we will skip our internal round of questions and immediately give the floor to the audience. Any comments, suggestions, things you want to say, not specifically about our panel, but in general? Yeah, Krista.
Oh, you have to catch the ball.
Yeah.
They've hidden the ball on you, Christoph.
Good.
Good catch. I can still sit though, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, I really want to thank all speakers and panelists and indeed the members of the audience for what I thought was a really informative and interesting series of comments and expertise and experience that was shared. I think we covered a lot of ground today, both within the convention, but also a number of issues outside the scope of the convention. You will forgive me if I focus in particular on maybe a few comments that do relate to the actual content of the convention, the 65 convention, and in particular the issue of transmission, because after all it is a convention on the transmission of documents to be served. And for my part, I try to remind me constantly that the overall goal is to shorten the time. That's the basic goal of the convention, to shorten the time it takes to transmit these documents, to safeguard guarantees, obviously. That's what's built in the convention as well. And there is therefore a clear relevance in relation to SDG 16. I think so far I've been the only one mentioning SDG 16, but it really matters. It really absolutely matters, and it is essential for effective access to justice, that we do take all these considerations, including time and effective, secure transmission, into consideration. Now, I should also say that I have been doing this for some time now. I have been with this noble organization for over 2 decades. We have had similar discussions in the past, and I kind of know how states react to these discussions. And these reactions can be very slow indeed. We have had discussions about the use of modern technology again and again and again. We have a series of conclusions and recommendations from special commissions that do encourage states to use modern technology, that do confirm the fact that the convention is technology neutral, and encourages states in particular also to accelerate the transmission of the requests. And yet we hear from a few states that yes, the transmission can be done by email, but most often then they still require the so-called original, whatever that means in today's world, to be sent in paper for the proper follow-up type of thing. That clearly, there's something wrong with that. And the other thing I try to remind myself also is that we should really try to focus probably on 80% of the cases where you have a forwarding authority, you have a clear address for a final addressee, you have a central authority that does its job, and how can we ensure the effectiveness of the convention within that very, very basic model of operation. And it is in particular for these cases that I think we should cater for a model that allows for swift, effective transmission while safeguarding securities. And in Article 10A, that's a fun topic, but when you consider that more than half of the conventions have actually, the states have objected to it, well, let's be real about it. And for as long as these objections are out there, we can make the nicest model around it, but it's just not going to work. Although I have to say, I, for my part, absolutely wholeheartedly support the interpretation that email is a model form of postal channel and can be used, but under the conditions that have been so well explained today. So that brings us to a few of the models that we have discussed. Frankly speaking, and I don't speak for the HCCH, this is just a personal view, and at the end of the day, we're going to do whatever our members decide to do. But I see huge challenges for the development of a central platform. Quite honestly, I don't believe it. There are huge issues of who is going to develop it, who is going to maintain it, who is going to pay for it, who is going to maintain it and upgrade it as technology evolves. I see quite significant privacy issues also wherever the central system may be located. So that's a huge challenge that would keep us busy for decades, well beyond 2030, which I remind you is the deadline for the SDG goals. Quite interesting developments on national level with these national platforms, in particular the Korean platform. I would be interested to know how many foreign forwarding authorities have actually signed up on such platforms. But if that allows for a swift, secure transmission of documents to be served, then that's certainly something to consider in hopefully not too distant a future. And then I guess that brings me back to good old email. Good old email that we all use on a daily basis. It's not that complicated to use a fairly secure, say, email transmission. Again, that probably offers much more security than the traditional postal channel. because everybody can open an envelope. You need quite some sophisticated means to actually hack an email. That's already more difficult to do. But I would really try to encourage all of us to allow for this electronic transmission of the requests to central authorities. What then the central authorities do in accordance with their own domestic law to execute the request, well, that's their problem. That's not our problem because we're outside of the scope of the convention. But of course, we should encourage them to do it and to keep up with these developments as they occur. But if we could already shorten the time it takes, and don't forget that according to the latest, by now probably quite old statistical data we have, we know that about 70% of the requests are executed within 2 months. And that includes the return of the certificate of service. Well, okay, 2 months, that's much better than going through diplomatic or consular channels, which can take years. But 2 months in today's world is still, I mean, my kids would say, what are you talking about, 2 months? I need it yesterday type of thing. So if we could facilitate the electronic transmission and let the central authorities deal with their domestic framework to actually execute it as quickly as possible and certainly send back the certificate, we would have done a huge favor already to all the users of the convention, to the convention itself, because again, 80% would be covered, and again, we would have contributed to an effective implementation of one piece of the puzzle of SDG 16. But thank you again to all. Who wants it?
Up on what Mr. Bernasconi said, and what happens if we establish this transmission system, the electronic transmission system, and the domestic authorities still they're not doing their job. Yeah. This is the question, and this is what we have discussed also in the course of the modification and the amendment of the service regulation. We have a provision in the service regulation which stipulates that the authorities have to try, and I have an example also from my jurisdiction. We wanted, some litigants wanted to serve proceedings to a country which I don't want to mention. It's a dear country to me, in the European Union. And this particular country could not find the whereabouts of a company, which is registered in the commercial registry which this country has. And then the claimants had to serve proceedings fictitiously, which is preposterous. If 2 months are preposterous, not being able to serve to a company is equally preposterous. So that's my point. I mean, of course, I understand the boundaries of the Service Convention and also of your tasks, but the countries, the contracting states have to understand that they have to do the extra mile. If they don't do the extra mile, then nothing will change. Who wants it now?
Can I abuse my position as moderator? I think indeed, because when you said that, Christoph, I was also thinking, well, is this not a little bit short-sighted to say, well, let's make sure that we have the transmission by email and then we will see what happens? That's right, and that's also what your point was. On the other hand, you have to start somewhere, and indeed, most states then eventually, a little bit earlier or later, will be able to catch up on that, and there will be issues or situations where it doesn't work. But indeed, we have to start somewhere, but we have to work on both issues, of course, simultaneously.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, it may be forced upon you. Yep. Because a lot of our jurisdictions are now bringing into being electronic judicial documents. Yep. So the very documents that are at issue are going to be in an electronic form. So you have to move to encompass that development because it's happening.
I know. Yay. Ooh, almost.
It's the hardest part. I have a question for all of the panelists concerning the interpretation, which is one of the points that many of the panelists have been discussing in the course of the day. Do you think there's no possibility of making an interpretation, for instance, for Article 10A to open postal channels, including electronic channels? Because I think that's at the core of many of the positions that have been presented.
Who would like to answer that? And I got the comment that you really have to wrap up, so a 1 minute answer to that. Anyone?
I think you're still going to have reluctance on the part of a lot of countries, and as Christoph said, so many countries have objected anyway. Okay. So, I mean, I think the ones who don't object are likely to say, sure, we'll accept email under the argument. In fact, David Stewart wrote an article about this 15 years ago or 12 years ago, and that you could simply interpret it. And I think enough places that accept mail would do that. Okay. I think the real problem is that too many places won't take it, period. So.